Good afternoon. My name is Winston McLean. I'm with Iron Wolf Consulting. I've been asked to provide a bit of an update in terms of some of the work that I've been doing these last 30 or so years, communicating to the mainstream public about First Nation and Métis issues, especially here in this province. It's been a heck of a ride. I got one of the best jobs on the planet, really. I get paid to talk about my people, and I have a good time while I'm doing it. So it's one of the most awesome jobs I've ever had on this planet. So I'm really glad to be here. I'm coming to you from Treaty Number 6, which is the homeland of the Cree and the Soto and some of our other brothers, and also our Métis cousins as well. It's also their homeland as well. Basically, I get hired to provide cross-cultural awareness training to folks in the mainstream governments and communities and even corporate Canada. They're trying to make good things happen in terms of how folks connect with our people, right? We actually live in a time of very unprecedented opportunity. There's a lot of change taking place in this country, and it gives me a lot of hope that the situation for my kids and my grandkids will be a lot better than I had when I was growing up. But this country needs a lot of great information about our people, because a lot of myths and misconceptions have popped up over the years concerning our people and how we fit into Canada and Saskatchewan. If we don't dissolve these myths and misconceptions, they can form into little hard balls of resentment that operate in the back of people's minds, and that can have an influence on how people connect with our people, right? And we only have to remember, some of the tragic outcomes and missed opportunities that can arise from these things. So, for example, our poor sister Joyce, who died in that hospital at the hands of those two nurses, and that happened about a year ago, and the controversies over pipelines, to realize that these myths and misconceptions, they have a very powerful influence in terms of how people connect with our people. So my job, as I've seen it for the last 30 or so years, is to dissolve these things, dissolve those myths and misconceptions, so we can have good working relationships in our communities and on the front lines and even on our borders, right? Now, some of the changes that are taking place in this country include, just about 30 years ago now, we signed this thing called Treaty Land Entitlement out in Winston. I was part of the First Nation team that negotiated this with Canada and Saskatchewan. And it's literally changing the face of Saskatchewan and Western Canada, for that matter, right? We're getting the opportunity to buy more land and have that land base added to our existing lands that we own and manage. And that's creating a lot of opportunity. But when this first came out, it was quite like a shock to the Canadian system, Saskatchewan system, right? Because the Indians are buying land. What are they after? What can I expect? And, some of the myths and misconceptions reared their ugly heads at that time. That's when I got started in this business. We also have this thing called the duty to consult and accommodate, which is a set of Supreme Court decisions that has fundamentally altered how governments and folks in the mainstream connect with our people when it comes to developing projects in our backyards. And that's getting us engaged in the economy like never before. It's actually kind of an exciting time to be in this business. But we also have this thing called the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which is basically the duty to consult, just elevated an extra few levels, right? And project should not take place unless we have free, prior, and informed consent that is provided in the advancement of some of these projects, right? And everybody, of course, is also familiar with the fact that we had that residential school agreement and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that stemmed from that agreement. And of course, they finished their work in 2015, issued all their recommendations, or in this case, calls to action. And I've been in this business, like I said, for like 30 or so years. And this is one of the first times I've ever seen a commission or an inquiries, recommendations, or in this case, calls to action, ever get acted upon, not just by governments, but corporate Canada, even communities like yourselves are trying to make these things happen in their communities and their organizations, right? And that's fantastic, because that gives me like hope that the situation for my kids and my grandkids is going to be a lot better than I had when I was growing up. And of course, recently we've had the so-called discovery of the unmarked graves in all these residential schools, right? Which really kind of was an awakening for mainstream Canada. For our people, we always knew those graves were there. They were not a discovery. It was just more of an acknowledgement that, yeah, we were right. But and I've been doing this business for a long time now, and I've seen the visceral reaction from some of my audiences about what has happened to our people in the past and how this is triggering a lot of our people even today, right? So I've been very fortunate to be able to be in this business, to do this kind of work, and to provide some great information in terms of how people can connect with our people. And I'm going to share with you some of my findings, some of the things that I've discovered in my journeys, and the work that I got to do with Mainstream Canada. Now, I should introduce myself a little more, because there is some controversy in Indian country right now about Indian identity, and I want to get this out of the way. I do descend from a long line of chiefs and even signatories to treaty, right? My ancestor, James Smith, was one of the signatories to Treaty Number 6, which was signed at Fort Carlton, just outside of Duck Lake. That was back in 1876. And his son-in-law, Jacob, was one of the headmen that signed with James Smith. So I got leadership and I got treaties run through my family history. That'll kind of give you an idea as to who I am in terms of the hour or so we got together this afternoon. As for who I am personally, I grew up on and off the reserve. My parents were among the first generation to be able to leave the reserve to look for a better life off of the reserve. So one point in his career, my dad was an RCMP officer. He was quite the athlete. He did a lot of work with the kids. So we worked in recreation. And he was a chief, obviously, at one point in his career. And we were even farmers until the grain prices tanked in the early 80s. We lost a farm. And Mom, who was going to be a nurse at the MRI clinic in a little clinic that we're opening up here in Saskatoon, really glad for Mom. She's finally learning to settle down, if you know what I mean. She's been a nurse for like 40 years up in the north. So glad and proud for Mom. But as you can imagine, we moved around quite a bit in my youth, following Mom and Dad. They were doing their thing. And as a result of that, I went to like 9 different schools before I got my grade 12, right? Which kind of explains a lot. I got my education at the University of Saskatchewan, where I studied, of all things, philosophy, right? I know everybody's terribly impressed with that. So was my dad. When I told him, I could see tears welling up in his eyes, like, how is this kid going to mess up his life this time? But it actually turned out pretty good, because look at me now. I'm a productive member of society. Yes, I am. I got my start working for my people 30 years ago with the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations, as they were called back then. And they had me working things like international affairs. I did a ton of work in land claims. I ended up running their lands and resources department. I did projects in economic development, social development, health, education, did a little bit of work in justice, a lot of policy and governance stuff. And I still do that kind of work to this day. And I'm even helping out my band deal with a little potential diamond mine in our backyard back home in J. Smith. So that's a little bit about me and who I am and where I'm coming from. And I got my start, like I said, with the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations. And I was a member of the team that negotiated with Canada and Saskatchewan, like I said, how to settle treaty land entitlements for at least 25 bands in this province. And in the course of doing that work, it revealed to me that there was a real gap in terms of knowledge and awareness about who our people are, what our aspirations were in terms of moving forward and providing a better life for our people, right? Relations with certain ministries at that time were either poor or non-existent. Municipal relations were practically non-existent. And the sentiments that were awakened by the folks in rural Saskatchewan were quite interesting, right? All the myths and misconceptions popped up. And that kind of told me that, we've got to provide some great information to governments, to communities, to organizations on how to connect with our people in good ways and to explain, what our people want in the future. I've had the benefit of working with some really fine people over the years that helped me develop my skills, my abilities as a facilitator, as a communicator. I started with my good friend, John Langimodier. He's a Métis, and he's actually really a great guy. I've been working with him for almost 20 years now. I've had marriages that didn't last that long, right? And you may know him as the editor of Eagle Feather News. And he's been publishing that for, I think it's almost going on 20 years, 25 years or something like that. He's going to be getting out of the business soon, but I'm really proud of being able to work with this guy because he's very entertaining as well. I've also had the opportunity of working with a fellow by the name of Lionel LaRoche. Now he's originally from France. He does cross-cultural training around the planet, right? Not necessarily First Nation or Métis issues, but he has applied some of the principles that he's acquired over the years to the work that he and I get to do together, right? And his book is Danger and Opportunity, and I highly recommend you pick that up if you're looking to improve diversity issues within your organizations, especially business, right? Because this guy, he knows his stuff. Now, in the course of doing my work for our people, trying to clear a path, as it were, for better relations, I've encountered tons and tons of myths and misconceptions concerning our people, right? And we only have, like like I said before, if these myths and misconceptions are not addressed properly, they can have an impact in terms of results. But in terms of addressing these myths, these misconceptions, these unfortunate concepts that pop up in people's minds, in order to address them, we have to delve into the history. Now, I know many of you will have already been aware of the history of the founding of Canada and the residential schools and so forth. But for those of you who may be new to this business, to this issue, I want to give you some insights in terms of a quick little briefer in terms of the ground that we have covered as the founding nations of this country, right? The way I was taught is that even before the coming of the European settlers and the fur traders, we've been on this land since time immemorial. And that means we've been as far back as our grandparents can remember, and grandparents and so on, for thousands of years, right? And some of our creation stories have that the Creator actually put us here, right? And He gave us ceremony and language and protocol so we could have a good life off the land. Back then, the buffalo provided us with almost everything that we needed to survive and thrive, right? And there was like millions and millions of these big sacred animals roaming these prairies. I'm told there's about 50 million buffalo roaming these prairies. And when you think about that, that's a lot of meat. And you're getting your food, your clothing, your shelter. Even some of your ceremonies are rooted in these big sacred animals. And there's lots to go around, right? And we were a pretty sophisticated bunch back then too. We traded, we made war, we made treaties, we even farmed. So a misnomer that we didn't have the gumption for farming, but we had some experience with farming back then as well. So we knew our game was tight. We knew how to connect, take care of our people in good ways. We were connected to creation, the Creator, our ancestors, and each other in pretty productive and healthy ways. The fur trade was a big game changer though. It introduced new technologies, new diseases, new opportunities, new threats, right? And we were partners in this endeavor back in the day. And what I find interesting about the fur trade is that in order to survive and thrive, these European traders relied on First Nation Indigenous protocols in terms of conducting business, trade, and making sure we had alliances and so forth, right? So they were playing by our rules initially. But as we all know, things changed. The buffalo died off for a variety of reasons. The fur trade collapsed. More and more settlers were coming into our territories, and we were in a hard place, right? So we petitioned the Queen, the Great White Mother, to come and negotiate some treaties with us on how we're going to live side by each and share the wealth of this great land. And the way that I understand it is that the treaties from our perspective were all about acquiring the tools and technologies of the newcomers so we can make a transition to the new economy, which was farming, while maintaining the Indian way of life, right? From the Government of Canada's perspective, the treaties were all about clearing Aboriginal title as per this thing called the Royal Proclamation to facilitate the settlement and development of the West. So we met out here in the prairies, we came to some agreements, we're supposed to be off to the races. But while we were negotiating the treaties out here in the prairies, some very smart cookies in Ottawa realized, you know, these treaties have a significant dollar value attached to them. They're like a drain on the treasury. So how do you mitigate government exposure to this liability? Well, fewer Indians, right? In fact, if you can assimilate and get rid of the Indian population, you've gotten rid of the liability, no problem, right? So they came up with this thing called the Indian Act, which was basically federal legislation designed to manage Indians and lands reserved for Indians. And in it, it defined who is and is not an Indian. You may be surprised to know that even the current definition of what it takes to be an Indian has nothing to do with our culture or spirituality, our traditions, whether we come from the land or whatever, right? It's a definition that's still technically designed to get rid of us as people. The Historic Indian Act also came after our culture. It basically drove it underground, made it illegal to practice our sweat lodges, our ceremonies, and that made it really difficult for the elders to do their job, which was to transmit knowledge to the next generation, right? On how to be a healthy, productive member of your community and make wise, practical decisions for yourself and your loved ones. We also, you know, in the treaties, we were promised the transition to the farming economy, but something happened to that. We were doing really well with farming. We were getting so good at it, though, that some measures are put in place to put the reins on Indian development in terms of farming. So we needed to have, there was a permit system that was created, which basically crushed our agricultural economy, right? Many folks are also familiar with the fact that there was a pass system that was created basically isolating us onto the reserves. It was primarily aimed at our leaders to prevent them from talking amongst each other. And but it was also applied to parents, especially to keep them from visiting the kids in the residential schools, because sometimes the kids would talk, right? But the legacy of this past system was technically not part of the Indian Act. It was just a policy created in Regina, but it was under this this cultural environment. It's one of the reasons why our communities grew up isolated from each other. It's one of the reasons why we're estranged from each other in terms of our respective communities. In addition, we also lost a lot of prime agricultural land. There was a lot of skullduggery involved in these particular transactions, right? And it takes a long time to settle these things in a modern day context, but good things do happen when we do settle them, right? Just about every First Nation in Western Canada has lost land under the Indian Act and the Indian agents and this regime. I'm told by experts working in the field it's going to take almost 200 years to clean up all the land claims in Western Canada, because this happened everywhere. It takes forever to settle these things, not only to research them, but to prove to the government of Canada that we got done wrong. So let's make it right in the modern day context. It takes a long time, sometimes 10 years, sometimes 50 or 60 years, if you know what I mean. And so it shocked a lot of folks as well that we could not get legal representation. So that harbored our ability to get some justice in the courts for some of the things that were happening to us, right? And also there were measures in the Indian Act on our leaders. You know, if you're a bad leader making life difficult for the Indian agent, you could be pulled from office and somebody more compliant would be installed in your stead. So that had a crippling effect on our development, right? And if that wasn't enough, then they came for the kids. Now, I know many of you are also very familiar with the residential schools story, but basically while we were negotiating the treaties back in the day, these same government officials also had conversations with church officials. And the conversation kind of ran like this. You know, we have enough shared goals and objectives that if we just collaborate and cooperate with each other, we'll be more efficient, we'll be more effective. We're going to do a fantastic thing and save these poor Indian people from themselves. We'll civilize and Christianize them up. And we're going to do them a big favor. Sadly, though, even if they had the best of intentions, the program was poorly thought out. There was very little oversight. It was poorly funded, and the opportunity for this thing to go sideways. Okay? And it did go sideways. There were physical impacts on our young back in the day, emotional and mental. There's even spiritual abuses that took place, and yes, there were sexual abuses that took place. Now, here's the thing, and we don't have time to get into the details in terms of how this stuff impacts people who are being traumatized, right? But the little bit that I do know is that because of this residential school program and the Indian Act as well, while the rest of this country was developing, and it was still a struggle for the folks that were developing, First Nation people were in basically survival mode, right? We were coping with the trauma and the pain that we've inherited from this particular legacy. Now, the way I understand how this trauma works, everybody on this planet, if you're drawing breath, you have some trauma in your life, right? And basically trauma creates a reaction in the physical, mental, spiritual, and emotional body that involves fight, flight, or freeze, right? This stuff gets encoded into the body. From here on in, you're either scanning for threats or new threats based on the original trauma, or you're self-medicating to deal with the trauma that you're reliving in present tense, right? And that gets people into trouble, right? And this stuff gets in at the genetic level, and a lot of this stuff is intergenerational. So technically, you don't have to have gone to one of these institutions to be living with the effects. And this is how this stuff gets spread around in our communities, right? Now, I used to believe a long time ago that people who are addicted, they're just weak of character, right? They have a moral character flaw. It's a rational process. All you have to do is think hard about your problems and the solutions and get on with life. You're just being lazy. You like that lifestyle. And then I read a book by Gabor Maté. And he's a Canadian physician working in Vancouver I think it's on the east side. It's in downtown Vancouver anyways. He's on the front lines. And it's his thesis that all forms of addiction, whether you're talking sexual, drinking, drugs, gambling, being a perfectionist, a workaholic, all these addictions can be traced back to some form of childhood trauma, right? So the men and women that you may see on the streets that are not doing so well, who are not living a good life, they're there not because they choose to be. It's because the options available to them to heal leave them in situations where they self-medicate and get into trouble, right? And it's fueled by the myths and misconceptions. So even if you're trying to pull yourself up by the bootstraps, all it takes is one ding dong to come up to you and say, you know, you're lazy, even if you're just lazy, pay your taxes and so forth, right? And there goes that little bit of self-esteem that you were using to power you through. Now that's gone, you're back to where you started. So the myths and misconceptions have that impact, right? And this was a taboo subject even back home. So even if you tried to release and share what happened to you in the stories, or in the schools, pardon me, you were typically told to dummy up. And you do dummy up, right? And those poisons, those toxins, all that trauma is still inside, affecting everything in your lives, right? The good news is we are starting to turn this ship around and head it in a better direction. There's a lot of healing taking place in our communities, right? And I like to remind folks that, you know, everyone and everything comes from someplace, right? We don't have the monopoly on dysfunction. It's rumored that there are some families in the mainstream who are dysfunctional as well. But this happens to be our story and where this stuff comes from, right? Now, the healing journey is taking place. I know men and women who are going on the so-called red road to get their healing. They're going to sweat lodges and so forth to get that healing they need. Some people are using Christianity. There's nothing wrong with Christianity. I have tons of Christian friends. They're awesome. Some people are blending the two, right? Others are using Western psychiatric methods or blending all three. The healing journey is taking place. So the men and women that are going to be working alongside of you, or that you may encounter in your communities, they may be on that healing journey themselves. But as we all know, some of our people are still have little ways to go in terms of improving their situation while on Mother Earth. And I like to remind folks that we are just as capable of getting the job done, because we want what pretty much everybody else wants on this planet, which is to provide a better life for our kids and our grandkids than we had growing up, right? So that's why I do this work, and some of the things that I've learned in my travels in terms of needing to impart the story about the history and where we've come from. Now, when I do work with corporate Canada in particular, you know, they really want to make these good connections with our people. Trio Untitled, the duty to consult and accommodate, the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, the calls to action, UNDRIP, is creating unprecedented change, and we're seeing people opening the doors and they want to welcome our people in, right? But they have a lot of pressing questions like, how do we make this stuff happen, right? How do we make good relationships, good communications take place? And I like to remind folks that Canadians actually have two distinct histories as well, right? We have the original settlers that came in over on the boats back in the day, often from European ancestry in particular. And that meant a certain set of values and outlooks and aspirations, right? More recently, we've had more people coming from the developing world, especially after the Second World War, right? And especially in the 60s and onwards. And they bring with them a different set of values and perspectives and aspirations as well. The definition of Canadian is pretty loose. It's been fairly stable. It's very multicultural, right? But the common question that I encounter from whether you're an ancestral Canadian or a new Canadian is, what do you Indians want? Specifically, what can we do to create a positive, supportive environment specifically for Indigenous employees or customers, for example, right? Other folks are afraid of saying the wrong thing. And what ends up happening, and what I've seen happen, is that good men and women, they want to have good connections with our people, but they're afraid of saying the wrong thing, so they end up saying nothing at all, right? So there goes, that's another missed opportunity. And some of them want to be able to argue on our behalf against some of those myths and those misconceptions, to make their Indigenous colleague, their employee, feel welcome and supported and protected, right? And they want to know what the realities are, right? So I usually kick things off in terms of helping them acquire this understanding by communicating, you know, what do we want? Well, we basically want business partnership or workplace or a community that values our contribution to the environment, to the enterprise, provides us with opportunities to advance, is sensitive to our history, and is a healthy and satisfying place to work. Now, who doesn't want that, right? Pretty much everybody on this planet is looking for that. It's not a surprise. But we've also got to remind folks that we see ourselves as products of our histories, right? We've got the Indian agents and government policies, in particular, the Indian Act. We've got the residential schools and the legacy of the residential schools, which is the 6C Scoop. And for those of you who may not be aware, this is a government program launched in the late 50s, especially into the 60s, where the federal government mandated social workers to come and get the kids and put them in adoptive and foster homes. While there were good adoptive and foster homes, there were some downright bad ones too, right? Which created even more problems for our people. But as a result of this legacy, we have a lot of first timers entering into the labor force. I consider myself very lucky. I'm second generation, but some of my relations, they may be the first members of their family to have like a real 9-to-5 gig, right? And some of these folks are going to be very traditional. Some will be more mainstream, and others are going to be somewhere in between. Now, what do I mean by that? This is supposed to represent your typical First Nation demographic. I have no science to back this up. This is just based on my 30 years of experience working for my people. But it's a kind of a useful illustration, right? Every one of our people in this demographic, they have their own set of hopes and dreams. They have their own goals and strategies to achieve those goals, right? They have their own personal concerns, and they have their own unique set of supports to help them achieve their goals and their aspirations. Everyone else, everybody as well, has certain traumas and anxieties, and everybody's traumas are going to be a little bit different. How they carry them will be different as well. Some of the stuff is going to be intergenerational, and they're going to have other kind of normal challenges that everybody experiences while they're on this side of the ground, right? Everybody's going to be unique. Now, on one side of this equation, you're going to have your very traditional folks. These will be men and women who spent most of their lives maybe on the reserve. Maybe they speak the language. They probably maybe spent time on the land, you know, hunting, fishing, trapping, and gathering. And they probably participate in ceremony as well, right? So the way they process information and move through the world will be different from my more mainstream relation. These will be men and women who spend most of their lives off of the reserve. They probably don't speak the language. They probably spend very little, if any, time on the land, and they probably don't participate in ceremony as much as they would like. So the way they move through the world will be different from my traditional relations, right? Now, what's the big deal about this? Let's take concepts like respect, right? Everybody loves respect. It's one of those motherhood statements. How can you be against respect, right? But what counts as respectful behavior amongst my traditional relations may be a little strange and alien from my mainstream relations. Likewise, what counts as respectful behavior amongst my mainstream relations could be a liability amongst the traditional folks, right? So there is diversity in our communities, right? And to give you some sense as to how this stuff works, the message that you intend to be sending across cultural lines may not be the message that's being received. And likewise, the message that you're receiving across cultural lines may be not the sender's intentions, right? So I encourage people to give people the benefit of the doubt. They're just moving through the world the best way that they know how, that they've been trained and based on their experience, right? And to give you some context, I figure I'm situated somewhere around here. I spent some of my time amongst the old folks. Wish I was smarter back then, I would have retained more. But most of my formal education and work experience has been in the mainstream. This is not a static picture. I can move back and forth on the spectrum as the situation demands, right? Now, to give you more examples in terms of how some of the stuff may manifest in terms of your working with our people or connecting with our people, I'd like to give you a couple of examples in terms of what truth means based on the Western experience and some of our brothers and sisters. Regarding truth, there typically is one answer. Now, there are methodologies designed to diminish partiality or hearsay to arrive at the truth, right? And there's a formal process to gain expertise, right? Typically, you go to a university or some other institution, you take the tests, you acquire the knowledge, and if you're successful, you get a piece of paper at the end of the process, and you're good to go, right? Also, in a work environment, to arrive at the truth, if there's no consensus, you use hierarchy, right, to resolve disputes or conflicts. On the other hand, amongst our more traditional folks. It's an acknowledgement that there can be many truths. Impartiality is in fact an illusion. And the way I understand it is that knowledge is an art and a science that's to be acquired through some form of apprenticeship. So you apprentice yourself to a master hunter, a master medicine gatherer, to acquire that knowledge that you're going to need to be able to survive and thrive, and acquire the skills and abilities that you're going to need to do well in the future. And only in the absence of consensus will a hierarchy actually be used, right? And there's specific processes to use consensus back home. I understand there's a question, Ben.
Yeah, hi, Winston. Thanks so much for everything so far. For those of you who are just joining or watching, I am the audience member that will be asking Winston some questions. But I really appreciate the slide and kind of differentiating a little bit between hierarchy and how that will resolve disputes and conflicts in concept of truth, and then of course in consensus. And I'm thinking about kind of reapplying this to things like treaty land entitlements, TLEs, and negotiations around that. Like how does concepts of truth and coming to decisions, consensus versus hierarchy, does that get in the way of establishing relationship between, say, governments and Indigenous people?
I'm going to approach this from just dealing with the First Nation side. So I was part of this process, and it was a fascinating experience. I was fresh out of the university when I joined the Federation and worked on treaty land entitlement. And so I got to see this in action. Historically, our people, we had tons and tons of time to arrive at consensus, to have discussions, right? And there was a process in terms of arriving at a consensus. Now, if there's a battle going to be fought, you don't have time to have a calm council and say, well, let's have a conversation about how we're going to address this threat that's coming over the hill. You're going to, at that moment, you know who you're going to follow because they're experienced in warfare, right? You don't have time for consensus. You just jump into action. So what I got to see during our negotiations with the federal and provincial governments is we erected processes internally to help have the consensus, have the conversations about what we want, what we don't want, how we're going to get there. And the chiefs would delegate authority to people within the Federation to get certain results in certain fields. My job was very limited back in the time, but we had some really great and powerful and very experienced people that knew how to do this business, right? And based on their experience and that consensus building, elements of consensus, delegating authority, we were able to achieve a result and maintain a unified front when dealing with the federal and provincial governments. And that's basically how that stuff gets done, right? The challenge for our people internally is how do we take those ancestral concepts and principles and adapt them to a modern day context, right? So that's how I got to see that unfold. Hopefully, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think that's just really interesting because I can see how both of those, I can imagine how from the Western experience, I'm sure that they have a different way of coming to what their approach is going to be with negotiations versus like they may not be coming from a consensus lens. I just think that's very interesting.
It's a very top-down organization, federal and provincial governments,
right?
And so they get their marching orders, right? Ours came the other way, from the communities, from the leadership, delegating authority to the Federation, and the Federation was just basically a facilitator for the First Nation team because they elected their own leaders to negotiate with the federal and provincial government, and the Federation role was just to support that team technically and provide resources to make sure that they had everything that they needed to get things done. Right? So that's one example of how things work. Another good example of some differences in terms of our relative experiences is regarding spirituality. Now, in the Western world, mainstream society, the spiritual and the secular, those are supposed to be kept separate, right? And there's a very good reason for that, because in their history, the church was involved in a lot of political matters, and some questionable things happened, right? Which is one of the reasons why so many people wanted to flee Europe and come to Canada to escape that persecution and all that corruption, right? And there was a definitive move politically, even in Europe, to separate the church from secular matters, from government, right? And they brought that across the big water. Now, in addition to the political and social stuff, the thinking in most Western minds, not all of them, but most, is that only some things have life. Just about everything else is inert. It's lifeless, right? It's just a thing. Land, for example, is a thing to be owned. It's a commodity, right? And there's also a belief in some sectors of mainstream society that Western constructs, Western ideals and principles are more advanced and progressive than what you may have in other societies, right? From our experience, the way I understand it is that everything is connected, everything is alive, right? Everything has life and spirit and energy. Land, for example, is a live being, and we have responsibilities to it, right? So owning this would be, it's like crazy talk, that we can't own the land, right? We are stewards of it, we are connected with it. And one other interesting thing I understand about spirituality and the differences in our concepts is that we follow traditions until new truths or realities require adaptation. So traditions are not like these monoliths that never change through time. The way I understand it is that traditions evolve and adapt. And if they fail to adapt, then they get really brittle and they tend to crumble, right? But a living tradition is able to adapt and bring in new realities, new concepts, new experiences into the core of the tradition, and that's how things advance into the future. Interesting. Also, how we connect with each other, right? In the Western world, personal and professional lives are to be kept separate, right? You do not bring your work home with you, for example. Likewise, you don't bring your home life into the work environment. In the First Nation experience, the way I understand it, the way it's been explained to me, is that we don't make that distinction. Traditionally, we didn't make that distinction. So who you are at work is a reflection of who you are at home. Likewise, leaving stuff at home is an impossibility. When you turn up for work, you're bringing some of that baggage with you, right? So we don't make that separation necessarily. And interestingly enough, gift giving on the Western experience can be construed as bribery, and it has legal implications, right? You're trying to influence the outcome. From First Nation perspective, gift giving is a part of a protocol. It has spiritual implications, right? It's you're renewing that connection. You're giving something of value from yourself, a sacrifice to renew that connection that you're trying to cultivate. Ben, you had another question?
Yeah, well, it's actually more of like a comment or addition onto this point. It is something that came up in one of my master's degree program, because we were talking about doing research with Indigenous communities. And one of the things, in research ethics, that's a no-no, is giving, you don't want to give people large gifts of any kind to do research, right? Because that could be constructed as bribery. And one of my classmates was very surprised when we were talking about Indigenous research that you make an offering to a leader of a community before you engage in research on a particular community, right? And his question was, is that bribery? Are we bribing to get results for our research, right? And so I just was like, well, and there was a good lesson learned here. And that's just one example that comes to mind when I think about this and how we need to differentiate in between these different communities when we engage, right? Yeah, that's all.
Yeah, I've always been curious that if you don't give that gift to the elder, to the leader, to the person you're approaching for knowledge, are you going to get all the gold, right? And there, of course, as First Nation people, we know that just giving tobacco to a stranger doesn't mean that stranger, that elder, is going to give you all the gold, because they don't know who in the hell you are, right? And because you want to cultivate that connection, that experience, that relationship. And as you earn their respect, you get more and more of the gold. So it's not like going to a university class, getting a download of information, and maybe having a test at the end to prove that you have knowledge. This is an ongoing apprenticeship that our elders are looking for, right? And the more you cultivate that relationship, the more gold you're going to get going forward, right? One other thing I want to leave on this before we run out of time here is, back in the day we didn't have this thing called crime. The way I understand it, at least the way I was taught, is that we don't have necessarily a word that corresponds with Western notions of crime. We do have this concept called pimohtēyahk, which, according to those that taught me, is you're harming your connection with the person that you're working with, right? And I researched the word crime in the dictionary, the Oxford English Dictionary, and it has roots in Latin, which corresponds to sin, which is you're harming your connection to the people, to whoever you're responsible for, right? So I found that really interesting, that the ancient Europeans have a concept that's pretty close to our pashtahawan, right? Now, I'm going to breeze through these next few slides because I do want to provide you with some tools, some tips, some insights on how to manage cross-cultural communications. One of them is the role science plays in our communications here in Canada, right? So in Canada, I don't know if you've noticed, but when some person A talks for a little while, there's a small imperceptible gap, and that's our signal to person B, it's your turn to talk. And that's how we carry conversations forward in this country. It's the most natural thing in the world. We think everybody around the planet does this. But we run into problems when we encounter some, for example, a traditional Asian person. I'm not talking second generation new Canadians. They will have adopted the Canadian model for conversing. What you may notice there is that person A talks for a little while, there's a longer pause, and then person B will start to talk. There's things happening within that long pause. One, you're showing them respect, and you're probably formulating a proper response based on what you interpret that they just finished sharing, right? And that's how you show respect. Now, when we encounter that as Canadians, how do we feel? That's awkward as hell. So we want to fill that gap in, right? And how does the Asian person, the very traditional Asian person feel? Well, you're not showing me respect, and you're definitely not giving me a chance to show you respect. And you can see how things go sideways if you're not aware of cultural differences. Things get even more complicated if you're dealing with somebody from Latin America or the Mediterranean, where you're talking over each other. So when I give this example, I encourage people to try to figure out where our traditional First Nation people might be coming from, especially when we're being asked very important questions. And it's closer to the Asian model, right? So just be aware that this may occur in your interactions. Let the pause hang there. The elder or the person you're interacting with they're thinking, they're doing stuff. Right? Eye contact is another area where there may be cultural differences because the lack of good, healthy eye contact can be interpreted as a sign of disrespect or lack of engagement and so forth. And for some of our traditional folks, maintaining eye contact when the boss is giving directions, that's like a sign of disrespect. It's like we're trying to challenge their authority, we're trying to steal their power. So we put our eyes to the ground as a form of respect. But to the supervisor who's not aware of this, what does that look like? Well, is this insubordination? Is the employee engaged kind of thing? When they're, in fact, what they're showing is like a high form of respect. I know we're in an era of what do you call COVID, and we can't shake hands anymore. But one of the ways that you can determine whether you're dealing with a traditional person or a more mainstream First Nation person is that moment of contact when you shake their hands. If it's a golf grip number 3 or 4 or 2 or 3, it's more going to be more traditional. If it's like a 6 or a 7 on that scale, you're probably dealing with someone who's more mainstream, and you can calibrate your game accordingly. Right? Humor, we use humor to maintain relationships in our communities, and because it's the way I understand it, especially amongst the traditional folks, it's also tied to morality and notions of like humility, right? And we often laugh at ourselves and at each other, right? So here's a little tip to let you know whether you're getting along well with your Indigenous partners. If we start to gently tease you, that means you're in, you're doing all right, okay? Now, again, I mentioned I consider myself very fortunate. I'm second generation into the labor force. So I get to see and have picked up over the years, especially from my parents, all those hidden cues and messages about what it's going to take to survive in a mainstream organization, right? Things like punctuality, professionalism, how to show teamwork, and so forth. I picked these things up. But a lot of my relations, like I said before, they're going to be first timers into the labor force. So all the soft skills, the unwritten rules for success are going to be brand new for these folks. So we encourage teams and organizations to appoint coaches and or mentors so we acquire those soft skills sooner rather than later. In fact, that just makes good business sense for any new employee joining your ranks. There are tons and tons of other differences. We don't have time to get into these things, but I do have a recommendation in terms of a book later on that'll help you get your head around some of these concepts. And probably the most, I guess, most illustrative example that I can use to highlight some of these differences has to do with manager-employee relationships, and especially in terms of giving and receiving direction, right? My friend Lionel LaRoche, who does that cross-cultural training around the planet, he had the opportunity to ask a couple of thousand IBM employees around the world in different work environments, two questions. I prefer working for managers who, on the one hand, give me enough freedom so that I can determine the best direction for myself on how to get the results that they're looking for, as compared to give me clear direction so I know exactly what you want me to do and how to do it and when to do it and so forth. It's very precise, right? And what he revealed in his years doing this, asking this question, is that Canadians want more freedom to determine the best course of action. Whereas you compare PK, which is Pakistan, they want more specific direction, more hand-holding, right? More clear direction, right? And you can see there's a lot of diversity around the planet in terms of just responding to this particular question. And there are implications for this in the work environment. Now, where the First Nation or traditional people fit, I tend to think that they want to be more to the left of the Canadian example, right? Tell me what you want. I will go out and try to make it happen. If I have questions, I'll come back to you later to figure it out. At least that's been my experience. Now, what I'm sharing with you, I'm really looking forward to hearing from my brothers and sisters in the audience. If you have some suggestions or you think I'm missing something, I would love to get that feedback, right? So I'm always looking to improve, to get the message right and make sure I'm doing a good job for our people. And if you're an employer, you've got to realize that some of our people are coming from very challenging circumstances, many of them, right? Some of them may have transport issues. Single parent issues is a big issue. We talked about first and second generation into the labor force, high family demands because of the crisis and trauma in our communities and our families. And so you're going to need to be very flexible and supportive and make some adaptations, some accommodations in terms of getting the employee firmly rooted and grounded and get some momentum to get you the results that you're looking for, right? We encourage organizations to create an Aboriginal strategy, especially the really big employers, and it may include making sure that you have a procurement directive so that all your subcontractors, for example, have to start hiring and retaining First Nation or Indigenous people, or partner up with firms and organizations or businesses that have a strong Indigenous component to them as well. Evaluate your harassment programs, right? Are they working? Are they getting you the right results? And how do you, one of the ways you can do that, exit interviews. The people that are leaving the organization are going to be a gold mine for what's been working and what hasn't been working in your organization. Right? Consult organizations like the Aboriginal Government Employees Network, AGEN, right? They have tons of experience in terms of, what our people are experiencing working in mainstream organizations. Engage leadership, not just the HR people, but we need the executives, right? The presidents, the leaders of the organization to get engaged in this kind of work as well, right? I talked about appointed coaches and mentors as well, and do whatever you can to make sure you got clear communications in your organizations, in your businesses. I'm going to wrap up this section by talking about allyship. And this is a common question I get asked: what can I do personally to improve the situation going forward? I have two concepts on this slide. One is Mio Wagoto and the other one's Mio Wachitwa. And the way I understand these concepts, they have a lot to do with making sure you have good, healthy connections, right? Lines of communications are really good. You're problem solving, you're creating wealth, especially off of the land, and you're lifting each other up to do really well, right? The way I understand Western concepts of prosperity, they link up really well, right? Because you're talking about safety, communications, problem solving, unleashing people's creativity, you're creating better policies and approaches, you're talking productivity and wealth creation. Now, who doesn't want that? But harassment, as we all know, undermines everybody's collective work in this regard. And we can all feel this, right? And so what do you look for? You look for the blatant demonstrations, especially those microaggressions, right? And especially examples of gaslighting, right? Pay attention to these things. I got some examples here for you to consider. Microaggressions can be as simple as violations of personal space, right? I had this happen to one of my sons. He was very proud of the career he was embarking on, and he was assigned to a very, very, let's say, mainstream organization. And he was supposed to take over the leadership of one of the individuals who was getting ready to retire. Now, this individual couldn't handle an Indian taking over his duties because it might make him look bad. So this guy did everything he could to make my son uncomfortable. He followed him around in his personal space, day in, day out. Now you can imagine how that impacts an individual on a daily basis, right? That just grinds away at your confidence and you don't feel welcome. Everybody else in the audience or in the work environment, pardon me, saw what was going on, but did nothing about it, right? And there was a lot of eye roll, displays of exasperation when my son tried to speak his truth. And as a result, there was gaslighting, which is basically boils down to you're trying to make somebody question their reality. You're actually making them crazy, right? It's called crazy making. So when you encounter stuff like this, I encourage you to take notes, right? And check with the victim, right? And my buddy Lionel does like training around the world, says you got to separate your intent from impact, right? It may not be your intention to violate somebody's personal space, but that is the impact that you're having. So we encourage people also to be open to making mistakes and letting people express their concerns and their fears and their issues, right? And that's how basically you make people feel more comfortable and welcomed in the environment. So take notes, check in with the victim that's getting the unwanted behavior, speak up and speak out. Silence is complicity with the bully, whether it's sexism, racism, homophobia, whatever, right? Speak up and speak out. You're not going to change the bully's mind. Don't expect to. You may get some resistance, some blowback. But what you do is you feed everybody in the environment the good stuff, right? The truth about what you see and what you understand to be the real case. And what will happen over time is that the bully will either realize that his or her beliefs and principles are no longer welcome in the environment, or they change their tune and jump on board, which is great. Another useful tip that my buddy John uses is ask them why. Keep asking them, why do you think this is the case? Why do you think that is the case? And just ask them the why. And the more they answer that question, the more racist and unpalatable their beliefs are going to be, right? And you're just playing a nice passive role. Well, why do you think that? Why do you think that? Right? It reveals themselves to themselves and everybody else in the environment. I also like to remind folks that being colorblind or neutral or nice is actually counterproductive. Now, I know folks who say, I don't see race, I don't see color, I treat everybody equal. That's a noble sentiment. You're trying to proclaim something really interesting, really great. But in fact, that notion actually makes you blind to the way other people use race or color or sex to discriminate against other people. So being color aware is actually more ideal. And you don't have to do this work alone. Find allies. Keep the conversation going. Book clubs are a fantastic way of making this happen. I got 3 books on this slide. Robin DiAngelo's Nice Racism. It's an eye opener, right? And it's a little hard to read sometimes, but it's out there, so it'll help you to recognize what to look for. She also wrote that book, White Fragility, another powerful book. But I also highly recommend Abraham X's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. Given what I do for a living, you'd think I'd be the most anti-racist person on the planet. And I picked up this book, and it made me realize that I too have issues that need to be addressed, right? So racism is neither an either or kind of proposition. It's on a spectrum. And as long as you're drawing breath, we all have work that needs to be done, right? So be open to doing that work. Reading this book actually made me not just a better facilitator and a servant for my people, but it also made me a better father, right? So, and there's my book, my friend's book, pardon me, by Lionel LaRoche, Danger and Opportunity. Again, I highly recommend that to give you some extra tips. Personally, you got to invest time and energy and resources into cultivating a relationship, especially if you're working with communities. Become aware of history and our ties to the land. Professionally connect early and connect often, right? Chiefs and councils, for example, and I assume this is going to be the same in Métis organizations as well. We're very short-staffed, right? Not a lot of resources. You're going to have to communicate often, right? And always be reaching out not just to the leadership, but to the staff that have been assigned to those specific issues that you're working on. Respect local protocols. Do the research. Cultivate a liaison in the community. Be aware of capacity limits, right? And participate in our ceremonies and our celebrations as much as possible, right? And do not assume that just because you haven't heard from us that does not mean that we're okay with the project, right? So communicate often, and make sure that your message is getting through, because chiefs and councils leadership back home, they're overwhelmed with issues. I got to see this with my own father when he was a chief. And there are benefits to making all this stuff happen. You get improved hiring and retention numbers, right? You get better policy that's being made at the senior levels. You got reduced legislative and policy friction, right? And improved relations with our communities and our governments, and you get buy-in for especially those big projects that require our free, informed consent down the road. Ladies and gentlemen, I had a blast. I hope you guys picked up something that's going to help you on your journeys. If you have any comments, questions, or concerns, or insults, that's from one of my other mentors, feel free to reach out to me. Here's my email address. I look forward to hearing from you guys. I wish you guys the best of luck in your work together. And yeah, we'll see you guys down the road.
Thank you so much, Winston.